My name is Emma Cole, and I'm 34 years old. 3 weeks after my wedding, on an ordinary Friday morning, my parents were watching the same national morning show they've watched for 20 years, Coffee at 7, my mother's ritual, when the host smiled into the camera and introduced the most beloved author in America that nobody had ever seen, and my husband walked out onto that stage under the studio lights. My mother turned around slowly. She had called my wedding embarrassing. She had stood up in the middle of the ceremony in front of everyone and walked out with my dad before the vows. But the broadcast isn't the story. What my mother did 3 weeks after that broadcast. The banner. The 200 guests. The toast she never got to give. That's the part I still can't quite believe. And what I did back, in front of the whole town she spent her life performing for, she will never forgive me for. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge. This is where quiet people finally tell the stories their families hoped would stay buried, told slowly, honestly, the way they actually happened. If that's your kind of story, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. I teach 3rd grade in Maple Falls, the kind of New England town where the hardware store still sharpens skates and everybody's business is a public utility. I've spent 10 years learning how to stand calmly in front of 25 8-year-olds, which is excellent training for standing calmly in front of my mother. Here is the job I held before teaching, the one I was hired into at 6 years old. I was the manager of my family's image. Nobody called it that. It looked like little things. When my dad got laid off from the electrical contractor the winter I was 12, my mother sat me down and taught me the sentence I was to say at school. "He's consulting now." I said it so well that I half believed it, even while I watched him do the crossword at 10 on a Tuesday morning with his jaw set like a man holding a door shut. I learned which family stories were tellable and which got rewritten in the car on the way to church. I learned to walk into St. Andrew's half a step behind my mother with my chin at the approved altitude. And I learned the sentence that ran our whole house, the one my mother first said to me outside those church doors when I was 6 years old and crying about something I don't even remember. She crouched down, fixed my collar, and said, "Smile, Emma. People are looking." Not, "It's okay." Not, "I've got you." Smile, people are looking. I got good at it. That's the part I have to be honest about because this story doesn't work if I lie to you. I was excellent at my job. I could smooth a scandal before it finished happening. And I hated how good I was, the way you hate a talent that was assigned to you instead of chosen. To understand my mother's kingdom, you have to understand that Maple Falls runs on visibility. Patricia Lewis has chaired the Women's Circle at St. Andrews for 19 years. She runs the Harvest Festival Committee the way small countries run their militaries. When someone in town has a surgery, a death, a disgrace, my mother arrives with a casserole, and the casserole is never just food. It's a census. She goes in with green bean bake and comes out with the full inventory of your kitchen, your marriage, and your odds. I want to be fair. Half the town genuinely loves her, and the half that doesn't returns her dishes washed and on time. In my mother's economy, success that can't be seen doesn't exist. A promotion is real when it's announced at coffee hour. A marriage is real when the right people danced at it. She has opinions about which families present well, and she has spent 40 years making absolutely certain the Lewises were one of them, with a discipline I'd call heroic if it hadn't been pointed at me. Her own childhood was a locked room. Her father, my grandfather, was never mentioned. Not once. Not at funerals. Not at holidays. I knew only that she'd grown up on Quarry Street, back when Quarry Street was the address that made cashiers count your change twice. Whatever happened there, she'd sealed it under 40 years of committee minutes and perfect hems. Ask my mother what love is, and she will answer you, without blinking, with a seating chart. So when her only daughter, the one she'd trained since 6 to manage the family's reflection, came home at 32 and said she was seeing the quiet man who worked mornings at the bookstore, my mother didn't ask if I was happy. She asked, and I quote her exactly, "What will I tell people?" Nathan Cole worked the morning shift at Fern and Feather Books on Main Street, and the first thing I ever watched him do was talk a furious 9-year-old out of quitting reading forever. The kid had been handed some joyless assigned novel. Nathan listened like the boy was a colleague with a grievance, then slid one paperback across the counter and said, "Don't trust me, test me." The kid came back a week later demanding the sequel. That was the whole man, right there. He was 35 then, quiet in a way that wasn't shy, quiet like a house with good bones. We dated slowly. He closed the store on Thursdays, and we'd eat chowder from the place by the depot, and he'd ask me questions no one had ever asked me, like what I'd loved before I was told what to love. 6 months in, on the porch of his little rented cottage, he told me the thing I am going to trust you with now. The thing that runs under every minute of this story. You've heard of C.J. Harlow. Everyone's heard of C.J. Harlow, the author of the Lanternfield books, the series in every classroom and every dentist's waiting room in America, the writer famous for never once showing his face. No author photo, no tours, no interviews, 9 years of guessing by the whole country. Nathan pulled a shoebox of handwritten drafts from under the porch bench and said quietly, "CJ was my sister, Claire June. She died 11 years ago. The books started as letters to her. Putting my face on them always felt like selling her." Then he looked at me the way you look at someone when you're handing them something breakable. I said, "Okay. That's all. Okay." And I kept that promise through everything you're about to hear, through every insult at every dinner. I kept it even when it cost me my own mother. We announced our engagement at my parents' dining table on a Sunday, under the good chandelier, which in the Lewis house is a courtroom fixture. My mother looked at the ring, then at Nathan, and asked the question she'd been holding since the day she learned his name. "What is it you do, exactly, Nathan?" And my husband-to-be, who has sat across from national editors and turned them down politely, said with total peace, "I shelve books, mostly. Morning shift." You could hear the furnace tick. My mother's smile stayed up the way scaffolding stays up, and she said, "How restful," which in her language is a declaration of war. By Tuesday she had searched him every way a 61-year-old woman with a library card and a prayer chain can search a man. She found nothing. No property in his name but a used pickup. No title, no LinkedIn, no family money. His parents were gone, and the only relative anyone remembered was a sister who'd died young. My mother delivered the verdict to me over the phone while I graded spelling tests. "You're marrying a bag boy with a hobby, Emma." I remember exactly where each red checkmark stopped on the page. Here's what took me years to understand, and I'll give it to you now for free. She wasn't objecting to Nathan. She'd have taken a cruel man with a good title in a heartbeat. She'd done it before, socially speaking, at every fundraiser for decades. What she couldn't survive was a son-in-law with nothing to announce, a blank space where the coffee hour paragraph should be. My father said almost nothing that whole dinner, which was its own kind of sentence. And me? I sat there holding a secret the size of a national bestseller list, and I smiled, because people were looking. Old habits have excellent posture. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story where I made the choice that everything else grew out of, and I made it in silence, at my own kitchen table. I could have said one sentence. "Mom, he's C.J. Harlow." That's it. 14 years of her favorite morning show has featured those books. There's a Lanternfield poster in the children's wing of the county library she fundraised for. One sentence, and her contempt flips to worship before the kettle boils. I sat with that sentence for a long time one night, tea going cold, listening to Nathan's typewriter, an actual typewriter, ticking away upstairs like patient weather. And I put the sentence away. For 2 reasons, and I knew them both clearly, which is how I know this wasn't me being naive. The first was the promise. He'd handed me the one breakable thing he owned. You don't spend someone's trust to win an argument they're not even entitled to. The second reason was harder, and it's the real one. If I bought my mother's respect with his name, I'd be agreeing with her scale. I'd be saying, You're right, Mom. A man is worth what can be announced about him. And here, look, mine announces beautifully. The same scale that had weighed me my whole life, smile, perform, present well, would just get a shinier weight on it. And someday, inevitably, it would be set on my children. So I chose the harder checkout line. I let my family believe I was marrying nobody, knowing they were wrong, knowing I could prove it, and declining to. If you've never done that, I can't fully describe the loneliness of it. My mother responded to my quiet the only way she knows how. She escalated to the venue. I wanted to be married in Dana Whitfield's apple orchard. Dana teaches art across the hall from me. Her family's orchard sits on the north edge of town, and in mid-May it snows petals sideways when the wind comes off the hill. 45 guests. Her husband Ben, who films weddings as a side gig, would run the camera. Folding chairs, pie instead of cake, my students' watercolor place cards. I had never been so sure of a plan in my life. My mother heard orchard and reacted the way other people react to the word audit. Her counteroffer arrived within the week. Fully built, like she'd had it warehoused since my birth. Ceremony at St. Andrew's, reception at the Elks Lodge, 200 guests minimum, the county paper photographer who owed her a favor, and a receiving line, so that the whole town could inspect the merchandise. A wedding in a field, Emma, she said, drawing the word field out like something you'd scrape off a boot. Like a livestock auction. I said the orchard wasn't negotiable. She regrouped, and what came next was not shouting. My mother doesn't shout. Volume is for people without leverage. She lowered her voice into its silk register and said, "Change the venue, sweetheart, or don't blame your father and me for what people will say. We won't be able to protect you from it." Notice the architecture of that sentence. The threat wears a nurse's uniform. The judgment is always somebody else's. People. The great invisible jury she's served her entire life, and she's just the poor bailiff. I held the orchard. She marked her calendar, and her RSVP card came back with the box checked yes and a note in her looping hand that I have kept to this day. We'll see how far you take this. The 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother ran a quiet referendum on my marriage through every kitchen in Maple Falls. My Aunt Carol Ann called to ask gently whether I was sure about this bookstore person. Because Patricia was just so worried, and had I considered how it looked, a teacher marrying a man who... Her voice dropped to the register reserved for tumors, shelves. My cousin texted me a real estate listing for a condo 2 towns over, captioned, "In case you need a fresh start, lol." The women's circle developed a sudden fascination with long engagements. None of it was traceable. That's the genius of my mother's method. She never says the cruel thing herself. She just seeds the weather and lets the town rain on you. Through all of it, Nathan stayed level. He fixed the school's ancient laminator because I mentioned it squeaked. He learned my students' names off the watercolor place cards and asked about the shy one every night. Once, only once, I cracked and asked him whether it bothered him. Being called a bag boy with a hobby by people who'd read his books aloud to their grandchildren without knowing it. He thought about it the way he thinks about everything, fully. And then he said, "They're reviewing the cover, Em. Everybody reviews the cover. You read the book." I wrote that down on a sticky note the same night, and it lived on my desk at school for months. So we sailed for the orchard. 45 chairs, pie ordered, petals loading in the trees like confetti waiting for a verdict. Before I take you to that morning, let me ask you something, reader to reader. Have you ever kept someone's secret while your whole family judged them out loud, held the one sentence that would have ended it, and refused to spend it? If you have, tell me in the comments how long you lasted. I read every single one. And subscribe, because everything you've heard so far is just the table being set. In 3 weeks' time, my mother is going to find out who she walked out on, live, on national television, on the show she's watched for 20 years. But first, she has to walk out. May 16th came in soft and bright, and the orchard did the thing orchards do once a year for about 9 days. It snowed upward. Petals everywhere, catching in hair, drifting across the folding chairs like the trees had opinions, and all of them were yes. Dana ran the morning with a clipboard and an art teacher's eye, rearranging pie tables by color story. Ben mounted his camera on a tripod by the third row and clipped a small microphone to the arch post. Remember that microphone. It has a part to play. My students' watercolor place cards fluttered on the long tables. 45 people we loved were finding their seats. And at 11:40, my parents' sedan came up the orchard lane, and my mother stepped out dressed as if for a deposition. Steel gray suit, good pearls, the handbag that only comes out when someone needs to be reminded of standards. My father wore the tie she chooses for him. They took their front row seats the way diplomats take seats at a summit in a country they don't recognize. During family photos, my mother placed herself, angled her good side, and when I, a bride, at my own wedding, in my grandmother's altered lace, let my face rest for one unguarded second, she leaned in close, fixed a strand of my hair without asking, and said it. "Smile, Emma, people are looking." 28 years since the church steps, word for word. The photographer counted 3. The shutter clicked. If you find that photo now, you'll see a bride smiling like a professional, which is what I was. Trained from 6. Best in my field, working my last shift. The processional music started. Dana squeezed my hand at the top of the rose, and I want the record to show. Even then, even after everything, I looked at those 2 front row chairs and thought, they came. Maybe that's enough. I walked myself between the chairs. My father hadn't offered. I'd stopped waiting for him to volunteer for things my mother hadn't approved in advance, and honestly, walking alone through falling petals toward Nathan Cole felt less like a lack and more like an accurate biography. He stood by the arch in a navy suit, no pocket square, because he'd given it to a nervous ring bearer who wanted to look fancy. That's the man. Pastor Reyes, who has known me since Sunday school, opened warm and easy, told the story of the 9-year-old at the bookstore without knowing half of what he was saying, and the orchard laughed in the right places. I held Nathan's hands. Petals landed on our shoulders like the trees were signing the license as witnesses. And through it all, in the corner of my eye, I could see my mother conducting her private arithmetic, scanning the rows and counting who wasn't there. No superintendent, no Rotary president, no county paper photographer to fix the day into the official record. 45 faces, and to her, not one of them counted as people. Her gaze moved over my students' watercolor cards, over the pie table, over Ben's tripod, and her mouth did the small tightening it does when a thing has been measured and found. Her word, always hers, embarrassing. I knew that mouth. I'd been managing that mouth my whole life. I turned my eyes back to my husband, because Pastor Reyes had arrived at the part we'd written ourselves. Emma and Nathan have prepared their own vows, he said, and smiled at us. And the orchard went quiet the way a classroom goes quiet when the good part of the read-aloud is coming. In that quiet, clear as a bell being stolen, I heard a wooden chair leg shriek against the ground behind me. My mother stood up in the middle of my wedding. She rose the way she rises at the end of a disappointing school concert. Unhurried, gloves gathered, a woman with somewhere better to be. 45 heads turned. Pastor Reyes stopped with his mouth open on my name. And my mother smoothed the front of her deposition suit, looked not at me but slightly above the crowd, at her invisible jury, and said, at a volume engineered to reach exactly 3 rows and carry to all of them, "This is embarrassing." Then she picked up her handbag, took my father by the sleeve, and walked out of my wedding. I want you to hear the specific sounds, because I will hear them for the rest of my life. The second chair scraping. My father's. Softer, apologetic even in furniture, petals shushing under her heels going down the aisle that wasn't an aisle, a robin somewhere going about its business, and 45 people not breathing. My father looked back once at the lane's bend. He didn't stop. Just looked back. File that away. We'll come back for it. And here is where my old life ended, not when she stood up, but 2 seconds after, when every face swung from her exit to me, waiting to see which Emma would answer. The manager, who would laugh it off, smooth it over, save the day for the family brand. Or the bride. I felt the manager reach for the door. I did. I felt the old sentence assembling. She's not been well. We'll laugh about this. And I looked at Pastor Reyes, and I heard my own voice come out level and certain and finished. Keep going. He looked at me. I nodded once, and I said my vows in my grandmother's lace, in falling petals, to the finest man I have ever known, out loud, complete, once, the way vows are said, in front of 2 empty chairs in the front row. Nathan's vows had a line in them about a lantern in a field that only I fully understood. I'll keep that one. Some things you don't perform. By Monday, Maple Falls had a version of my wedding, and it wasn't mine. It had gone out through the casserole network before the leftover pie was wrapped. Emma Lewis sprang a marriage on her poor parents. Nobody even knows this man. Patricia was blindsided. You know, she found out he doesn't even have a profile anywhere? She had no choice but to leave. Staying would have endorsed it. I heard my own wedding retold at the pharmacy by a woman who didn't see my face in time. In her version, my mother's exit was reluctant, dignified, almost protective. The word hasty appeared. The phrase that poor family appeared. The casseroles stopped arriving at my parents' house is what should have happened next, if the town ran on justice. Instead, they stopped arriving at mine. Metaphorically speaking, since what actually stopped was warmth. A couple of parents at pickup found reasons to talk to the other third-grade teacher. The women's circle sent a card congratulating me on my elopement, which took real craftsmanship, considering there'd been invitations. Dana ran interference like a linebacker in a cardigan, cornering gossips by the copier with her bright